Great. Well, thank you so much for coming. It's most appreciated. This is my colleague Gary from InfoDocket. I'm Stephen Rintut from Coherent Digital. Nearly said Alexander Street Press there. Let me start. I don't know how many of you know, but this is actually a peat bog in Scotland. And it's kind of interesting because I found out that actually there's more carbon sequestered in the peat bog than there is in all the forests in England. So it's a pretty important thing getting it right, how we manage peat bogs. So Professor Mark Reed is actually an expert in this area. I mean, really an expert. He's got 7 of his papers are cited more than 1,000 times. He's had a ton of funding, $6.5 million to actually research peat bogs. And interestingly, he's also an expert on impact. He's very interested as to how the research he does gets promulgated. So what he did was map the linkages of his research as a network. So you can see here we've got various organizations. The thicker the line, the more interactions there are between those organizations. And the nodes indicate how many connections there are. So if you take a look, what you see quite quickly is that he's doing a lot of work with charities, interest organizations, NGOs. The partnership organization's kind of an outlier. That's just one group he works closely with. But government agencies, departments, scientific publications are quite low down. In fact, if you take a look, it's kind of off the grid slightly, which is interesting. What's more, if you take a look, all these links are actually URLs. And they don't have DOIs. And they don't have ORCIDs because they're not traditional publishers. They don't have much metadata. They tend not to maintain archives. And they're absent from most of the databases we know. They're not in PubMed. They're not in Agricola. These are items of great import that are hanging by a thread. If you take a look at Scopus, and we looked at a number of organizations and how many links from within the academic journals actually lead out to this gray literature. We looked, unfortunately, we don't have the wherewithal to do this across all organizations, but we did it for the EU and the World Bank and some of the larger organizations. And you can see that from 2005 through 2021, in some cases, there's been an 8-fold increase in citations leading outwards towards gray literature. We also researched as to how many citations are actually coming out to gray literature from different disciplines. So it's about 10% in nursing, 12% in engineering journals, 40% of PhDs in engineering, 75% of general studies. And in fact, most broadly across all disciplines, about 80% of the researchers across disciplines say they use gray literature. So we depend on URLs to find, access, and cite. But if one researcher has $6.5 million, think how many researchers and how much money is actually tied up in this network. And one of the interesting things for me and why I wanted to do this talk was, I think very often LinkRot is painted as a humanities issue, as a social science issue. It's interesting for historical reasons. But what I wanted to convey is actually it's really important for today's research that we solve this. So how's the URL infrastructure actually working for us? Well, we're kind of underwater. I was able to find a number of different studies that show just how quickly materials are disappearing. So in the field of engineering, for example, about 50% of this gray literature, this fugitive literature, will be unavailable within 3 years. It's extremely fast. On the generic internet, this, if you're interested in this area, this is the Pew Report. 38% of web pages from 12 years ago are no longer accessible. And it varies hugely, but 21% of government sites, 54% of Wikipedia pages. There's this massive world going on where links are being disappeared. We've also got a number of bad actors. In the cultural sphere, if you take a look here, these are all squatters who've taken over a domain that expired and use it to increase their Google search rankings. So we see the Bank of Sierra Leone, the Bank of Sierra Leone is actually selling marijuana, apparently. We have a site called African Music Profiles, which used to be a really great biographical database of African musicians. It's now a Japanese dating website. All of these sites were actually taken over by people interested in increasing ranks. I took a look at a couple of LibGuides, one in particular from a major organization. The number of broken links on that LibGuide was 50%. And it actually led to these documents. So I think in the cultural sphere, we have a big challenge. In city agency and government documents, we do a lot of crawling at Coherent. In the case of city websites, we've had experiences of as much as 20% loss within 3 months. Why do city websites change so quickly? Well, they have voluminous amount of content, and when they change control, very often, they're forced to actually take down materials that the new administration doesn't like. If you take a look at changing technologies, very often when a city is confronted by changing its website, upgrading its website, oh my God, you're really going to charge me that much money? How could I make that money cheaper? Oh, if you get rid of all the content from, say, longer than 5 years, we'll make it cheaper for you. We won't have to host it. We won't have to re-index that material. So in the area of politics and government and agencies, there's massive loss. In the area of think tanks, projects, and commissions, many of these think tanks were funded with the sole purpose of creating a report or a series of reports. And when those reports finish, what happens to the website? It goes away. Commissions, projects, inquiries, again, they're by their very nature ephemeral. So what kind of solutions do we have to this? Well, I hope all of you know about the Internet Archive and Archive.it. Perhaps the greatest effort ever to actually collect this material. And there are a number of typically national initiatives to try and do the same. There are also a number of permanent identifiers who attempt to actually canonically identify individual items so that at the very least you knew that that item existed, even if the link is no longer findable. I want to talk a little bit, though, about the map. So I have all the bibliographic references in the back here for you to check yourself. In 2016, the only number I could find for the size of the internet measured in web pages was one from Google in 2016, and they estimated about 120 trillion web pages were out there on the open web. Google's index, no one's actually sure, but they think it's between 40 and 60 billion web pages. So actually, Google's only indexing a relatively small percentage of the websites out there. So the Internet Archive has done a fantastic job of covering very broadly websites to a 1 or 2 or 3 layers deep. They've actually got, as of last looking, I think 940 billion web pages. They're going to actually reach 1 trillion web pages before too long. But the work they're doing doesn't necessarily serve what we're doing. So we have Archive.it, which actually is doing vertical probes, which are deeper. There are about 1,500 Archive.it collections, and those collections are also intended to go deep and actually archive. Gary's going to talk to you in a minute about some of these initiatives and how you can participate. The one I want to talk about a little bit is what we've been doing at Coherent Digital to actually help solve this problem. So one of the things we noticed was both Archive.it and the Wayback Machine, their fundamental purpose is to actually archive entire websites over time. So they take snapshots. And I hope I've made it clear, I think that's a fantastic and really important thing. But typically what scholars need most is immediate, highly indexed access to canonical documents. So they don't want 20 copies with a snapshotted over a long period. They want one document. Now, if the document materially changes, of course, they'd like the successor document and the predecessor document. But in many, many cases, what we're dealing with here is the difference between doing a massive automated crawl and doing a deep dive in specific disciplines. If one does a deep dive in specific disciplines, and you needn't do this with Coherent, there are plenty of others that can do this, you can actually extract the gems from the internet and make sure those are preserved. So our goal has been to build living archives of key documents. I use the word living because in many cases what we want to do is link out to the original document while it's available, and only when it disappears do we represent our copy. Why do we do that? Because many of these organizations depend on traffic as their way of justifying how popular they've been. In this way, typically when they've decided to remove it from their website, it's because they no longer really care about the content, or for financial reasons, they can no longer maintain it. We spent a lot of time, and I encourage you to do the same, to identify key organizations that are worth keeping. With 130 or 120 trillion web pages out there, the idea that we're going to be able to capture all of this is just not going to happen. The valiant efforts of the Internet Archive to do so are amazing, but how many of us can actually afford that kind of broad crawling? We want to capture the items within. So the trouble with websites is very often they're very amorphous, and it's very difficult to actually figure out a way, especially with archive websites. But buried on those websites are PDFs, are blogs, are podcasts, are audio files, video files. Those are really the gems that we need to preserve. We need to make sure we create permanent links. So if you're familiar with ARCs, and you saw the list earlier, if you're familiar with DOIs, all of these links help us catalog what was actually available. And that's the first step. In fact, on the Internet Archive, one of the tantalizing things is quite often you'll be on a website, and like an archaeologist, you can see what it used to be. Here's where the main room was. We've got 3 bricks high. I wonder what went on in the main room. I can see it was there. Sometimes we see lists of 200, 300 PDFs, and we can see what the PDFs were. But when we click on the link, it didn't go deep enough in the time. So far, Coherent saved about 20 million items. And if you subscribe to any of our products, there's actually a tool to help you do that. But my purpose here is not to sell Coherent. My purpose here is really to be clear that eliminating LinkRot, of course it's about history and culture. I thought you might be interested. On the left there, we have the world's first web page, except that they didn't realize they should save it for 9 months. So CERN didn't take a snapshot of the website until 9 months after the original web page, by which time it had already changed. Can you imagine if the Gutenberg Bible, we didn't collect the first edition, the Gutenberg Bible, but by the 9th edition, we realized this was important and we kept a copy. We've got to do the same. The second is the first search engine, and the third is Google's first page. These are clearly of cultural importance and should be preserved for posterity. But for science, for our bread and butter, for things like climate change, it turns out that the tundra in Russia is actually very similar as far as environmental impact as peatlands. And we all know how big the tundra is. From across Russia into Canada and Alaska, how much carbon sequestered in there. All of these disciplines that you see on the right depend very importantly on immediate access, just as they do for the books and journals of this content, so they can canonically cite it and make sure that this material is available right now, as well as for the future. So the bibliography is here, and I encourage you, because I just took the highlights here of some of the points. There are so many awe-inspiring statistics about how big this problem is. I thank you for your attention, and I'm going to turn over to Gary.
Thank you, Stephen. We just need to do a quick... Thank you all for coming. While you either take a snapshot, all of my resources are available. Let me make this a little bit bigger. Just by take a snapshot or that URL. But while you're doing that, I just want to reiterate and agree with my colleague here about the importance of the Internet Archive, and specifically the Wayback Machine. It is vital, and I don't know what, for historical purposes, what we would do without it. Quickly, my name is Gary Price. I do a lot of different things. I guess I'm a librarian and also a consultant. Get a little bit bigger again. I contribute to, I either edit or contribute to 4 newsletters. One of them is a newsletter for Stephen's organization, Coherent. We do a weekly newsletter with Toby Green, and Toby and I are always looking for new reports that will appear in Policy Commons, one of your products. I also do a newsletter, which I encourage all of you to take a look at, called ARL Day in Review. I do a website called InfoDocket, which we're 10 years into. And lately, I'm doing thank you. I'll pay you your dollar when we're done. And in the last year or so, I've been working with an organization, with Choice and their new LibTech Insights product. And it's interesting. We've been doing some little 5-minute introductory videos about different tools. And by far the most popular one is our introduction to a service from the Internet Archive and the Wayback Machine called Save Page Now, which, again, if you have never used Save Page Now, how many of you have ever used it? For those of you who haven't, thank you for those of you who do. I don't work for Brewster, but thank you for those of you who do. For those of you who don't, it's one way to save material and get it into the Wayback Machine. And it's also important that I mentioned that it's not just web pages. It's also, if it's a web accessible XLS file, for example, a spreadsheet, if it's a web accessible PDF, it's all in there. And I should say too, when I share material on InfoDocket or Day in Review, or I send an email to my friend Jim in the back, everything I see, I personally archive in the Wayback Machine. And I also often, which is the focus of today's talk, make a copy for myself. So while I couldn't agree more with the efforts of what Wayback is doing. Another way that I would hope that you think about this is archiving things for yourself and then perhaps contributing those URLs to the Wayback Machine using Save Page Now. There is another feature for the Internet Wayback Machine called Batch Upload, where you can take, I think, up to 50,000 URLs, put them into a Google Sheets, go to sleep, and by the time you wake up the next morning or soon thereafter, all those URLs now have been made copies. There are copies of them in the Wayback Machine. So many ways to. So what I'm talking about today is help with LinkRot, as Stephen said, and I think there's both an effort to do it personally, and then share your personal collections if you choose to, or selectively with the community through Internet Archive. Right, Stephen, you can actually save things to Coherent as well. Yeah. So that's another place you could be putting material. I want to make sure that want to make it clear for the copyright topic, I'm talking about saving these things for personal use. Now, if you can contribute URLs, and we saw with the Internet Archive lawsuit, even the people who were suing them absolutely positively saw and understand the need for the Wayback Machine. So I want to make that clear. I also want to make a point about not only a document, a URL disappearing, meaning you can get to it on Monday, and when you go there on Tuesday, the URL is just dead. But, and Stephen touched on this, is the versioning. What you see on a particular website, for example, a news site, what you see there at noon might be different by 2 o'clock, and might be completely different by 4 o'clock, so on and so forth. So I think the common term for this is versioning. So the more robust, the more times an article or a document is saved, we now have access to history. How did the New York Times article, for example, look at 3 o'clock might be different than at 5 o'clock, and what was added or what was removed can be very valuable historical information that in the print age was very difficult to get to, if not impossible to get to. Another reason, and if you take some of what we're talking about today and share it with others, one group of people that I've noticed over the years who always say, I wrote an article for X news organization, X website, and now they've gone out of business, is journalists. So there's an example of a group of people who often forget to save things themselves And now they depend on the Wayback Machine for the most part to hopefully have made a copy. I think journalists are a good example, and students and academics should be making copies for themselves and then consider sharing them. So we talked about that. So we have a role to preserve, historical reasons, so on and so forth. I can't get to everything. I also want to make a point about how we could also, individually and as a group, contribute to a web archive. And that is, again, doing it locally, sharing it. And that is, I believe that citation standards need to change. Meaning, when you save a URL and you note that you went to CNN.com or any public website to grab an article that you're using in your research, that you should also, at the point of the time that you're doing the research, a copy should be made and then either save locally and then contributed, or contributed directly using the Save Page Now feature to the Wayback Machine. This is not only helping make a more robust Wayback Machine, but to use the phrase my father used, it's a CYA moment. Because you could have in your bibliography or a bibliography a link to a document, and then it's either gone or something has changed what you're talking about, and now there's no way to actually go back to what you actually saw. And that's why I would encourage all of us as a group, and even if we can't convince others to do this, I think when a person is writing a paper and contributing it, they should at least be making copies of the URLs that they saw when they were doing the research. We got on a half an hour, 40 minutes so far, and the two, as we like to say in aviation, Alpha India. We haven't mentioned those two letters yet. So I'd like to share with you one way, and this is some of the work I'm doing for Coherent and for other organizations, that I'm using AI. And I also, before we get to that, I also want to make a point that the needs that we're talking about here for textual material are the same, if not greater, for multimedia material. And I've given you some examples of where you can find archive material. And I have also all these tools for you, which we're not going to be able to talk about each one. But these are some tools that I use and I encourage you to take a look at. One of them, for those of you who use Macintosh, is an OS X app called Downy. And this makes saving, whether it be a YouTube video, a Bloomberg News video, a video from some university, very, very easy. And now you have a copy of that video on your own machine. If there is one tool that makes a lot of what we're doing for local use, for your own use, and or as a group, the simplest way to do this, in my opinion, to have a permanent copy of what you saw, is a tool that I'm going to bet more people are going to raise their hands about, and that is Zotero. Zotero, let me open this up here. So Zotero makes a permanent copy of what you're seeing at any given moment. Let me scroll to get this smaller here. Oops. So what I have been doing lately for some of the work, including some of the work I've been doing for, matter of fact, they just walked in, some of the work I've been doing for LibTech Insights, is when I share material with them, I am making a permanent copy in Zotero of whatever article that I'm sharing with them, right? You with me so far? Now, of course, it's one thing to save a lot of things, but how are you going to get back to it in a timely and efficient manner? Now, of course, I could be going through it and say, I could keyword search it, but also what about all of the metadata? So what I've been doing lately is I've been experimenting, and this has been really, really illuminating and interesting and educational for me, and I encourage you to think about doing this. So now you save something in Zotero. Now, with the tools that I have listed here, so Zotero, there's all sorts of, like so many things, there's many different price levels for it. You can use it for free, or you can get more robust and you can use it for a fee and get more access. I actually went out, and almost everything I have listed for you, by the way, is free. but I do pay about $100 a year for their AI layer, which is, I believe, using OpenAI and Anthropic's Claude. So what I'm able to do now seamlessly is everything that I save in Zotero gets automatically, using a free plugin called Notero, gets transferred into Notion. Now, again, whether I'm using Zotero originally in its own format or here, I don't have the time to start adding great or useful metadata. So at least I have a good chance of getting back to it. With the AI layer from Notero, each one of these columns, so for example, LCSH, I have created a prompt, and I said, for this particular column, extract, in your view, in the AI, to extract up to 5 Library of Congress subject headings to best describe that article. So each one of these columns can be created ad hoc using the AI here. So if I want to say extract names, extract whatever, give me a view about this, it will do that for me automatically. So it's a great way not only to have everything in one place, have, again, good enough metadata in some cases to get back to it. But it's also a great way, forget about all the archiving things for a moment, it's a great way to see a practical use of AI and allow you to experiment with it. Because I have noticed, and I'm sure many of you have noticed, prompting is really a huge issue, right? So I can have 3 different columns with slightly different prompts, and it's a great way to experiment with real-world data, how the different prompts react and what they actually provide. So that's how I'm able to, 1, make a permanent copy in Zotero, and now put it on into Notion, have all these different columns, some come, some go, and now I have everything in one place, and I can get back to it very, very quickly, and of course, share it with other people. How are we doing on time?
48.
Okay. The worst thing is to keep people late, especially at lunchtime. I have a bunch of other tools here for you to take a look at. One that I've also been experimenting with that also will make a permanent copy for you is a bookmarking tool. So you can save all of your bookmarks. It's called Raindrop. And along with having a live version of the page, it also will make a permanent copy for you. So you click once for the live version, that's gone, that's changed, whatever. You can click again and have a permanent copy that was saved when you save the bookmark to Raindrop. Single file is also a great, fast, free tool to right-click on any web page, any HTML web page, and make a permanent copy, 1 click to your hard drive that you can comment on, that you can put Post-it notes on, and then you could attach, for example, to an email, and now you have a copy permanently of whatever you saw at any given moment, and those sit on your hard drive. We've talked about Save Page Now a couple of times. I encourage you to take a look at that. It is by far vital. And you could either go to the Save Page Now website, paste in a URL. There's all sorts of bookmarklets. There's the Internet Archive browser add-on, which makes it even easier. And I don't think it's come back fully yet from their recent issue with the hacking, but normally before that, if you select it, not only will it make a copy of whatever URL you put in Save Page Now, but it will go out and archive all the outbound links from that page at the exact same time with that same 1 click. So again, consider saving things locally. Show people how to do this. I think this is very vital because, again, what's here today, the ephemeral nature, what's here today is gone tomorrow. Save it locally, contribute it to the community. Thank you, and I think we have a moment or two if anybody has a question for Stephen and I. Thanks.